Wait. Before we start, just want to make sure we're clear here. While this podcast talks about sobriety, mental health, and addiction, it is not meant to replace professional medical advice. Welcome to Sisters in Sobriety.
I'm Kathleen.
And I'm Sonia.
And we're ex-sisters-in-law, brought together in marriage and bonded through our sobriety journey.
Join us as we talk sobriety, addiction, and everything in between. You're in for quite a ride. And our Substack is buzzing with amazing content, from creative mocktail recipes to insightful courses and reflective exercises. There is something for everyone. Don't miss out. It's a great way to add some extra joy and depth to your journey. Check it out. Welcome to Sisters in Sobriety. Today's guest is Dr. Eric Garland, a clinical researcher, psychotherapist, and a leading expert in mind-body therapies for addiction and chronic pain. He's the developer of the Mindfulness-Oriented Recovery Enhancement, or MORE, an evidence-based approach that integrates mindfulness, cognitive behavioral therapy, and positive psychology to help people break free from the addictive patterns and reconnect with meaning, joy, and natural reward. Welcome, Dr. Garland.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks so much for being here. I love the MORE method, and I wanted to figure out what brought you to it. So you have such a unique career, just bridging neuroscience and psychotherapy and mindfulness. But what first led you to this work?
How far back do you want me to go?
Far back as you want to go.
All right. I think I always gravitated to, actually, this is an inauspicious start to this interview. Let me restart. So what brought me to this was my own personal practice of mindfulness. I've been practicing mindfulness for over 30 years now. I started learning mindfulness back in college. That was really when I first encountered it. And from the very first time that I practiced mindfulness, I knew that it was going to be one of the most important parts of my entire life. I discovered that not only was this approach a way to increase my own well-being, but even more fundamentally, mindfulness gave me deep insights into the nature of myself, the nature of reality, and helped me to tap into what I would consider as important spiritual truths about life. And so initially, I actually was fascinated by philosophy and comparative religion. And I actually wanted to get a PhD in philosophy and comparative religion. But fortunately, I was rejected from every one of those PhD programs. And I say fortunate because I would have lived a life of abject poverty had I gone into religion and not into psychotherapy. But early in my career in behavioral health, working with people, I started to weave in the principles of mindfulness into psychotherapy. And I had a private practice earlier on in my career as a clinical social worker. And I was working in an integrative medicine clinic alongside doctors and nurses. And I was the head shrinker guy. And they would send me their toughest cases, the patients who they just really didn't know how to help. So people with co-occurring disorders, substance use disorders, mental health problems, psychosomatic conditions, and chronic pain. And so those early therapy sessions really became the living laboratory where I started to integrate not only my personal experience with mindfulness, but also my knowledge of addiction neuroscience and the key philosophical approaches behind the MORE therapy. And that really became this rich environment where MORE started to emerge. And then I started to become not only addiction therapist, but also an addiction scientist. And the more I learned about the neuroscience of addiction and the cognitive science of addiction, the more it seemed to me that mindfulness was a key part of the solution. But in addition to mindfulness, mindfulness is the heart of MORE. But in addition to mindfulness, it became apparent to me that we needed other techniques to help address one of the key problems in addiction. And I hope this is something we'll talk about during this episode, which is the fact that as we become more and more addicted, the brain becomes less sensitive to natural, healthy pleasure, joy, and meaning in life. And that has to do with the impact of addiction on the brain's reward system. So the person finds themselves in a hole. There's just this emptiness inside, and they're always scrambling to try to fill the hole by taking higher and higher doses of the drug. But that just is a vicious cycle, right? Digs the hole even deeper. So understanding that neuroscientific model of addiction then led me to realize that we need something more than mindfulness, maybe pun intended, which is we need to teach people how to reclaim the sense of natural, healthy pleasure, joy, and meaning in life. And we can do that by training the mind to focus on and appreciate and savor the natural everyday pleasures and positive events that happen to us on a daily basis. And to really, by cultivating the mind in this way, suck all the marrow out of life, just really stop and smell the roses and open our minds and hearts to feeling good again naturally. So that was a key part of this therapy as well. And then as I started to do clinical studies of more funded by the National Institute on Drug Abuse and the NIH, the data just started telling the story that these techniques were really important. And that just became the snowball that led to this 20-year research program, over $90 million in federal grants, supporting more than 16 clinical trials. And now, fast forward 2 decades later, we know this thing works. We know that it's one of the most effective treatments for substance use disorders that's out there today.
And so when you're talking about these clinical trials, what are the outcomes that you're looking at? Is the outcome just relapse? Is that the negative outcome, and the positive outcome is sustained sobriety? What are the different metrics that you're looking at?
Great question. There are a lot of metrics of MORE's efficacy. So I'll just rattle off some of the key statistics, the key numbers for us here, so your listeners can get some context for this conversation. So I think MORE really has the strongest evidence base of any therapy for co-occurring addiction, emotional distress, and chronic pain. A lot of therapies that are out there, they are effective at dealing with any one of these problems, but there are very few therapies that are effective at dealing with all 3 of these problems: addiction, emotional distress, and chronic pain. There are very few therapies out there that can tackle it all at once, but that's what MORE really specializes at. So, for example, some of the key statistics in the MORE research program, we've shown that MORE reduces drug relapse by 42% more than standard therapy. MORE also reduces addiction treatment dropout by 59% more than standard addictions care. MORE therapy is 3 times more effective than standard group therapy at reducing opioid misuse. MORE cuts craving by about 50%. And in addition to these addiction-related benefits, MORE also has powerful effects on physical pain. So MORE reduces chronic physical pain by about 25%, with effects lasting 9 months after the end of the 8-week therapy. And a 25% pain reduction is about as much pain relief as you get from a dose of OxyContin. We also have shown that MORE has really powerful effects on improving mental health. So MORE has robust antidepressant effects. MORE leads to clinically significant reductions in PTSD symptoms. And MORE enhances positive emotions and the sense of meaning in life.
So what is the connection between addictions, chronic pain, emotional distress? And are they more connected than we realize?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. They're highly connected, even if we look just at the prevalence of these problems. So let's take opioid use disorder, for example. So 50% of patients with an opioid use disorder have chronic pain. And that probably doesn't surprise us if we reflect on how this opioid crisis began to begin with. It was really chronic pain that was driving this crisis. But chronic pain is also highly prevalent in other types of substance use disorders, including alcohol use, smoking, cigarette smoking, and many other drugs of abuse. But there's a high comorbidity between substance use disorders and emotional distress as well. 50% of patients with an SUD will have a mental health diagnosis like depression or PTSD or anxiety. So that's just answering your question from a statistic standpoint. But why are these things connected? I think they're connected because people use drugs to escape pain, whether that pain is physical, whether it's emotional, whether it's spiritual. It's natural to reach for anything that promises relief. But when we do that, we fall into this trap because over time, drugs to alleviate pain, whether it's physical pain or emotional pain, then actually causes changes in the brain's reward system, like what we just discussed. And that really robs us of our ability to experience natural, healthy pleasure, joy, and meaning in life. And so the person feels empty inside. And the natural consequence then is they want relief. So they take a higher and higher dose of the drug. And so they get ensnared in this downward spiral. And that has a lot of negative effects on the brain and the body. And I could elaborate on that if you want.
Yeah, I do want to talk about that a little bit more, but I really want to get to what more is and how it integrates those pillars of mindfulness, reappraisal, and especially savoring that you mentioned earlier.
Yes, great. So more is really designed to directly tackle this problem of the comorbidity of addiction, emotional distress, and chronic pain. It does this by more of the sequence treatment. So it begins at the foundation of mindfulness training, and mindfulness training, we could think of it as form of mental training. It's a practice of strengthening the mind, of exercising the brain's capacity for controlling attention, for regulating your emotions, and for improving self-control by enhancing self-awareness. And so through mindfulness, we strengthen the mind, and that enables us to gain control over automatic habits, including the automatic habit of addiction. It also gives us a way to relieve distress and pain by using the basic capacities of our own mind to find this inner sense of well-being and peace. So mindfulness is the foundation of more, and we train mindfulness through various meditation practices that are designed to activate the state of mindfulness in the mind. But then in more, that's the foundation, but then we build upon that these two other therapeutic pillars. And the second pillar is reappraisal. So reappraisal is really the cornerstone of CBT. And this is the idea that we can challenge and change our negative thought patterns. And then if we challenge and change our negative thought patterns, this will reduce negative emotions and decrease self-destructive behavior. So we teach patients how to reframe the challenges that they're facing in their life as an opportunity for personal growth or a way to find meaning, even in the face of adversity. So that's the second pillar of more. And then the third pillar of more is this pillar that you mentioned, which is savoring. And that's all about focusing the mind on what is pleasant, beautiful, and good in life, and then trying to appreciate and amplify any positive emotions or pleasurable body sensations that come up in the mind and the body as you're engaged in a pleasant life activity. And then really, really trying to take those positive feelings in. And the metaphor we use is breathing them into the center of your being, like water seeping into the soil. So really just focusing all your mental power on appreciating and enjoying the moment as a way to increase natural pleasure and joy in life. So those are the three basic pillars of more, but happy to dive into any of those with you.
Yeah. So why do people in addiction lose that ability to feel pleasure from normal life? And how does more reset that brain reward system?
Yes. So why this happens is because you could think of addiction as a process of learning that has become dysfunctional. So before a person falls into the trap of addiction, There are people, there are activities, there are values that they care about, and the brain learns that those people and activities are rewarding, and it ascribes the sense of reward to those activities and those people, and that's what makes us motivated to continue to do those things. And this is really happening in the dopamine circuits of the brain that are involved in controlling our attention, telling us to pay attention to the things in life that are important to our goals and what we're looking for in life. But addiction actually hijacks the same brain system, this dopamine brain system, because most addictive drugs, either directly or indirectly, they're modulating dopamine. They're affecting how much dopamine is being released in the brain. And so a drug releases this massive blast of dopamine. And so the brain relearns, hey, maybe it's not these people and healthy activities and values that are what really matter in life, but what really matters in life is taking this pill or smoking this pipe or drinking this drink that then that leads to this huge release of dopamine. And so the brain's basic value system becomes dysregulated. The brain relearns, hey, these things that I used to think are important and valuable, now they're not, because they don't release as much dopamine as the activities that get me this drug. And so the person becomes constantly seeking and compulsively seeking to access the drug. But the problem is the problem of tolerance, which happens to everybody who becomes addicted, which is that over time, the seeking and obtaining of the drug and using of the drug releases less dopamine. The person gets less of a reward out of it. So they need to up the ante. They need to raise the stakes. They need to take higher and higher doses of the drug, or they need to move on to more and more intense highs as the brain becomes more and more blunted and loses this ability to experience pleasure. So that's in a nutshell, that's the neuroscientific explanation for what's happening during this process. But what Moore is really trying to do is to reverse this process. So by teaching people how to savor natural, healthy pleasure and joy, again, this will actually decrease the pull of the drug and therefore reduce craving and addictive behavior. And that's an idea, but it's not only an idea. We've done over 20 years of science to prove it. And we've shown this in many, many studies now that as patients go through the Moore program, their brains and bodies become more sensitive to natural, healthy pleasure. And the more sensitive their brains and bodies become to natural, healthy pleasure, the less they crave drugs and the less substance use they fall into.
So what are some practical ways that you teach people to savor? Because I think when I got sober, I never thought about it consciously, but that's what I was sort of training myself to do. And I have like all sorts of like really nerdy hobbies. And in that sense, like I have changed so much, right? Like I don't want to go out and party till 1 a.m. And so how do you, on a practical level, I wish I had a guide on how to do it back then. So how do you train people to do that?
Yeah, great question. So I guess the how to, first we start with this, as I said, this foundation of mindfulness. So I don't think a person can just necessarily go straight from being deep in addiction and then jump right into savoring. It may not be that effective, because the first thing we need to do is to teach the person how to gain control over their mind, which, as we know, if you really fall deeply into substance use, a lot of times it starts to impair your thinking. It starts to impair your ability to focus. You may feel scatterbrained or dull or distractible. And so we have to work at the core basis with basic mindfulness practices to just teach the person how to gain control over their attention again. And so that means simple practices like mindful breathing, where we're teaching the person to focus their attention on the sensation of the breath moving into their nostrils as they breathe in. And if you've ever tried this, like for most people, your mind's going to start to wander after 10, 20 seconds. It's off to the races. And then your job is to be aware of when the mind has wandered. So notice when the mind wanders off into la la land. And then you don't have to beat yourself up about it. Just become aware that the mind has wandered and accept that that's what your mind has done. And then you let those distracting thoughts go and you bring your attention right back to the sensation of your breath moving into your nostrils. And so that basic loop, we call that the loop of mindfulness. Each time you do that, you're strengthening the mind. You're strengthening the brain's capacity to focus attention. And you're also strengthening another piece that's really critical to addiction recovery, which is you're building your capacity to become aware of when your mind is slipping off into automatic pilot. And automatic pilot's a key part of addiction, because one of the things that happens with a person as they fall into addiction is the drug use that in the beginning, maybe they were really intentionally choosing to use drugs because they liked it, or they thought it was going to solve a problem for them, or they thought that doing drugs was cool or would make other people like them. That conscious choice of drug use, the more you do it, starts to become ingrained as an automatic habit. And eventually the person gets to a place where they can even tell you, I don't want to do this anymore. I know getting high is ruining my life. I know this is killing me. I'll stop. But then they keep doing it anyway, because by that point, addiction has really hijacked the person's will, and they're now engaging in addiction automatically. So mindfulness is not only useful for stabilizing and strengthening attention, but it's also useful for noticing when your mind is slipping off into automatic habits, and then gaining control over the focus of the mind and bringing it back to the point of focus. So that basic platform, first we have to introduce that before we even teach the skill of savoring.
And how does that idea fit into cravings? So are cravings something that we're trying to prevent with mindfulness and attention, or is it something, can we use mindfulness and attention when we're in a craving, or both?
Great question. Yeah, that skill is key to using the more approach to dealing with craving. So the first step is becoming aware that you even are having a craving in the first place. I'll never forget, I was working with a patient, and I asked him, hey, tell me about, what are your triggers for your addiction?
Mm-hmm.
And he said, what do you mean? And I said, yeah, tell me, what are your triggers? What kind of things are you experiencing in life? What do you see? What do you hear? What do you smell that triggers the desire to get high? He said, I don't know what you mean. He said, man, the sun rises and the sun sets. The wind blows. I feel happy. I feel sad. Everything, man, everything is my trigger.
Yeah.
And that really stuck with me, because that's actually not the case, by the way. That was just, he was not aware of what his triggers were.
Yes.
Because the whole thing was so unconscious. It was such a deeply ingrained automatic habit at that point that he did not know what was happening that was triggering the addiction. So the very first step in that case is introduce mindfulness, teach mindfulness so the person can become aware of when craving is even happening. And then when when you're craving, you can start to become aware of what's triggering it, and then you can deal with it. So to answer your question, that mindfulness is really key to first developing the awareness of craving. And only once you're aware that you're craving and you're aware that you've been triggered, then you can actually use mindfulness to relieve the craving. And I can describe that to you when you want.
Yeah, that would be great if you could describe that.
Yeah. So the technique we teach in MORE, we call it sort of two parts to it. The first part is We call it zooming in. And so what we do is we teach the patient to use mindfulness to focus on and zoom into the experience of craving, almost as if you had like a microscope. If your mind was like a microscope and you could zoom in really closely into the experience of craving and break it down into the parts that make it up. So rather than just think I'm craving, for example, noticing the sensations of jitteriness or feeling tension in the muscles or feeling the heart is beating faster or noticing that your mouth is filling up with saliva, noticing that the craving is also made up of thoughts like, I don't like this. I wish I didn't feel this way. Or why can't I just take this drug? I just want to get high. There might be an image in your mind of yourself about to use the drug or, take a drink or eat the pill. There might be emotions of shame or anxiety. So really pulling all those pieces apart by using mindfulness to zoom into the experience of craving. And we guide the patient to really focus intensely on the sensations themselves and to notice, do the sensations of the craving have a center? Do they have edges? Are there spaces inside the sensation where there's no sensation at all? And I know that sounds kind of weird, but when people actually practice this, very oftentimes they discover as they focus deeply right into the heart of the craving that it's not this solid, overwhelming thing that they thought it was, but actually there is some space inside of it. And maybe it's more manageable than they thought it was. And if the person gets too overwhelmed, we guide them to return the focus of their attention back to their breathing. So right back to the sensation of the breath moving into their nostrils as a way to calm down the mind, calm down the body. We guide them to imagine sending their breath right into the craving. So imagining breathing into the craving to kind of soften it. And then just watch it and notice how it's changing over time. Maybe the sensations of the craving are more like a wave at sea. They reach a peak and then they hit a crest and then they begin to fade away. Noticing how the quality of the sensations is changing over time. And it's a truism that cravings don't last forever. So if we watch them mindfully without giving into them, they will exhaust themselves on their own. But usually that's not what we usually do, right? Usually when you feel a craving, what you do is you go and do the thing that you're craving and you satisfy it. And that actually makes the craving stronger. But this mindfulness process is really the opposite of that. And like I told you, we find really powerful effects of more reducing craving with many studies showing that it cuts the strength of craving in half.
And so at what point then in this process does that cognitive reappraisal come in?
Yes, thanks for bringing it up. So that's so zooming in is the first part of the technique.
Yeah.
So we have the patients use mindfulness to zoom into the craving and pull it apart. The next piece is we bring in cognitive reappraisal and we have the patient think about the consequences of indulging in the craving. So we ask them to think, what are the negative consequences of indulging in this craving? And that, a lot of your listeners are probably familiar with this concept of playing the tape out. So we tell them, play the tape out. Yeah. See how, if you do this, what it's going to do to you. What are the negative consequences? And then we ask them to contemplate, what are the positive consequences of not indulging in the craving? If you were to free yourself from this craving, how would your life become better? How would that help you and help the people that you love? So there's this active cognitive reappraisal of the craving and its consequences. And then the last step of this process is we tell them to let go of all of these thoughts and feelings and then to step back into this space of mindfulness where you can witness your thoughts and feelings and cravings like clouds passing in a clear blue sky and noticing how experiences come and go and disappear on their own naturally. And noticing that there's a part of your mind that's like the thoughts and feelings and sensations that's passing like clouds, but there's this deeper part of your mind, which is more like the space of the sky in which the clouds pass. And that is a metaphor for for the deepest part of the human mind, which is really awareness itself, that is open and spacious and perfect and free. And so we guide the patient to focus on that part of the mind. And that whole technique, that sequence of zooming in and then contemplating the consequences and then zooming out into the space of the sky is a very powerful technique.
Do people ever, in your experience, do they misuse the technique essentially and use it to do emotional bypassing, which we hear a lot about, that like extreme mindfulness leading to sort of bypassing of what's really going on? Or is that something that just doesn't happen with this technique?
I would say this technique is the opposite of bypassing, because
Mm.
we're actually guiding people to focus deeply and intensely right on the craving, right on the difficult experience. And by the way, we use a very similar technique to help patients to cope with pain, physical pain or emotional pain. We teach them, not, instead of trying to ignore it or suppress it or distract themselves from it, we guide them to actually focus right into the heart of the painful experience and to break it down into sensations and thoughts and feelings, and to really observe and accept and honor those experiences, but to not be trapped by them, and to recognize that who that person truly is much bigger than any one thought or feeling. Who the person really is much bigger than any one craving or any one pain. So
And
no,
if
I
we
don't
move,
think it's spiritual
yeah.
bypassing.
And then when we move to other approaches, what do you see in more traditional approaches that's not working?
Great question. Well, and that'll let me segue back to savoring to answer the savoring
Yeah.
question. I think traditional approaches are mostly a negative approach. What I mean by that is that they focus on removing negative influences. So avoiding triggers, preventing relapse, reducing craving, uh, reducing resistance. It's like, what are you taking away? Right. And, even as you think about, for example, residential treatment, what are you doing? You're removing the person from their triggers and the
Mm.
people, places, and things that cause drug use. And that makes good logical sense. That keeps the person safe. It's easier for them to not fall back into drug use and relapse when they're not around the people, places, and things. And so the person gets sober, they stop using drugs, and then they leave the 30-day program and they go home, and they're right back to the people, places, and things. And then they relapse and they go right back to it. Right. So I think most of the the most common approaches take this tack, including even cognitive behavioral therapy, which is all about reducing stress, reducing craving, removing triggers, so on and so forth. All that stuff's good, but okay, now you've removed all this stuff, you've taken all this stuff away, but what are you going to do to fill the hole? What are you going to do to fill the empty void that you've created? Now that you've taken all the stuff away from the person, how do you fill that hole? Well, more, I think, does something very different than the other existing approaches, because by teaching mindful savoring, we're teaching people a way to make themselves feel good naturally. We're teaching them, we're not just taking away the drug and taking away the craving for the drug. We're giving people something else that can fill that space that had once been filled up with addiction. And so savoring is really the core of that. So you asked, what does that look like? So what it looks like is first guiding the person to become aware of pleasant life experiences. And I'm not talking about like going on vacation to Tahiti or, winning the lottery. I'm talking about the everyday little kind of pleasant experiences and events that happen all the time that a lot of times we don't even take time to notice. Like, for example, enjoying a hot cup of coffee in the morning,
Mhm.
feeling the warmth of the cup in your hand, smelling the scent of the coffee. You enjoy the way it smells. You enjoy the taste. Actually turning your attention towards this experience and really appreciating all the pleasant sensory qualities of the experience. And not only noticing the warmth of the cup in your hand and the pleasant smell of the coffee, but also noticing when you swallow that coffee, how does it make your body feel? And how is it affecting your emotions? Hearing a bird singing in the tree outside of your kitchen. Instead of rushing around to do your chores or listening to a podcast or TV to distract yourself, what if you just listened and heard that bird song, how beautiful it was and how happy the bird sounded? How much pleasure could you extract from that little moment in life? And I think all of us, whether we're addicted or not, fall into this trap of not noticing or appreciating the small little pleasures around us. But it certainly becomes even worse in the case of addiction. Another example, your kids get a friend over and they're playing and in the backyard and they're laughing, running around, kicking a ball, laughing, having a great time. Seeing the smiles on their faces, hearing the sound of their laughter, knowing that your child has a friend and how beautiful it is that they actually have a friend, how important it is in life to have a friend, and appreciating what the feeling of friendship and knowing that your child has this connection and feels loved and allowing those feelings to fill yourself up from the inside. So in order to appreciate these things, you actually have to stop and bring mindfulness to them, because otherwise life is just too damn busy. And we're just running around day to day, doing our to-do list, checking things off, one thing after the next. And we miss out on all of the joy and pleasure that we can get from the simplest parts of life. But that's really important, right? When we're talking about addiction recovery, because those little sources of pleasure and happiness, that's what provides the biological substrate of reward and pleasure that our brains are craving. And we have to learn how to get that back. So I really think of savoring as this form of weightlifting for your brain's reward system to rebuild this capacity. And I'll stop talking here and let you chime in here. But one other point about savoring that's really important for your listeners, a practical piece of advice: when you're savoring something in this more therapy approach, there's two parts to it. One is focusing your attention on the pleasant sensory features of that experience. So what are the pleasant things that you see, that you hear, that you smell, the pleasant touch, taste, movement of your body in space. So, focusing on this pleasant event or experience, its pleasant qualities. That's part one. But part two is then notice how that is affecting your mind and your body. Become aware of when positive emotions start to arise in your mind. Become aware of when pleasant sensations start to come up in your body. And the trick to savoring is this: when you notice the positive emotions coming up in your mind and you notice the pleasant sensations coming up in your body, then you turn your attention inward and you savor the positive inner feeling. So now your focus is not on the pleasant experience as much as it is on how it's affecting you. And you savor that positive inner feeling and imagine it breathing in that positive feeling into the center of your being, like water seeping into the soil. Just let it expand and fill the whole space of your being. And then you feel good for a while, and then that good feeling starts to fade away, and you turn your attention back out to appreciate another aspect of that pleasant life experience. And you refresh the savoring, and then you just go through the process again.
So as much as this sounds like behavior change for me, all of that added up to a pretty significant identity shift. And do you find that? And can that be jarring for people in recovery, that all of a sudden it's like I'm this person who enjoys drinking coffee in the morning instead of just like chugging coffee to get rid of this hangover. And so it is a little, there were moments for sure. I still have them where it's like, who am I? And so do you find that too, that there is an identity shift, and is it always positive?
Great question. And that actually points to the fourth, I call it the fourth emergent force of more. There are the three pillars: mindfulness, reappraisal, and savoring. And those lead to the fourth. And the fourth is self-transcendence. So there is this important aspect of recovery, which involves self-transcendence, this notion of going beyond your limited sense of yourself, transcending who you thought you were and the identity that you had built up. And quite frankly, if you're deep in addiction, your identity is the identity of an addict. Addiction becomes who you are. Getting and using the drug becomes the central point of meaning in life. That's who you are. And you give up the parts of your life that used to define your identity, right? The people, the activities, and the values that you once cared about. All of that gets hijacked, and you lose that part of yourself, and instead yourself becomes defined by addiction. So I think really to fundamentally transform this problem, we do need to transcend that previous identity and in a very real sense, become a new person. Or maybe it's reclaiming the person that you once were, but you're never completely the same because you've grown from this experience. And so one of the key paths to doing that is having this self-transcendent kind of experience where you connect with something greater than yourself. And I think that bridges to the 12-step program and the ideas of connecting with a higher power through conscious contact and prayer and meditation. This notion that if you connect to something greater than yourself, something beyond yourself, this can really be a source of meaning and a way to create a new identity. But I think you're right. I think that process has got to be jarring for people because it's really changing who you are and who you thought you were.
And how does the more method connect, or how can it be used with the 12 steps, or can it?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's highly complementary. What is that? Step 11, conscious contact with the higher power through prayer and meditation, I think.
I'm
But
Googling.
I don't know, but I think it is. So the 12 steps
Making contact. Number 11, making contact.
Thank you for verifying. So with through prayer and meditation, so it directly references meditation, but 12 step doesn't teach meditation. So here we have an evidence-based, neuroscience-informed program with more that provides a well-tested pathway for meditation to achieve this. So I think in that way, it's highly complementary.
What does relapse look like in someone using more? I know that the stats are really good about the success rate, but when somebody relapses using the more system, do they just go back and kind of like start again from the beginning? Or like, how do you handle that?
That's a great question. Really, and this may be a difference between more and other approaches out there. More is definitely a harm reduction approach, which is we know people are going to have lapses. That's part of recovery. Unfortunately, some people have to go through multiple lapses before they finally learn what they need to learn in order to break free from addiction. So, we don't shame people when they have a lapse. We investigate it. That becomes part of the therapy. We have conversation around it. You know, what was happening in that moment that led you to have the lapse? What triggered you in that moment? And when you experience that trigger, did you make then the conscious decision to use substances, or was it an automatic habit that just snuck up on you? And then we really break it down step by step, and guide the client to start to understand what were the choices that they made in that series of events that led to the substance use? And then what did they do in the fallout of that substance use? Did they then go on a binge and go into a full relapse, or were they able to stop themselves at a certain point? And to use a quote from a previous more patient, did your mindfulness kick in? When did your mindfulness kick in, man? And maybe you started getting high, but then a couple hours later, you realize what you were doing and you cut it off. And if you fall off the wagon, then you can get back on it again. But we guide the patient to really take a careful look at what happened in the moments leading up to the lapse and how they coped with the lapse and how they can learn something from that experience to prevent a lapse from happening again in the future.
And so do you see more as a harm reduction more than an abstinence model? And where does like moderation fit in this?
Yeah. So good question. So we've tested more really across the whole spectrum of addictions treatment from prevention all the way through treatment and long-term recovery. And we've also tested more for people with who are at different stages of change, from pre-contemplation and contemplation to getting ready to take action to change behavior, and all the way to, I've already decided I want to change my addiction, and now I just need help to maintain this decision and maintain my commitment to recovery. So we've studied more at all these different stages in different groups of people, and find that it's beneficial in different contexts. So for example, you asked about moderation. What comes to mind there is we've done a lot of work in patients who have chronic pain, who are prescribed opioids for pain, but who may be at risk for misusing opioids, or they may be misusing opioids, or they may have a full-blown opioid use disorder, and everywhere in between. But if you take the folks on the early end of that, where they have chronic pain, their doctor's given them opioids for pain, they have a legitimate prescription for pain, and they may, quite frankly, they may need to be on opioids for the long term or for their whole life, depending on their medical condition. But in those patients, we're using more to reduce the harmful use or misuse of opioids, and to reduce the amount of opioids needed, so that the person is taking the lowest comfortable dose necessary in order to get the pain relief they need to navigate their life. And more is really highly effective in that group of people who they're continuing to take opioids, but it's just reducing the misuse and helping patients to decrease their dose. On the flip side, we've also shown that more is highly effective, as I said, in preventing relapse. So we actually show that in patients going through medication-assisted treatment, so patients on methadone for opioid use disorder, that more is, if you add more to standard methadone treatment, it drops relapse by 42%, more than standard addiction treatment alone. So really on both ends of the spectrum, from a harm reduction, moderation perspective, and from a prevention of relapse perspective, we show that this therapy is useful.
And so for somebody who's starting to build some awareness of their patterns around substance use, what's a simple exercise from more that they could try today?
Great. I have just what the doctor ordered. And also, by the way, to build on the last conversation, I think for problems like addiction to cigarettes or alcohol, or even overeating, or maybe the person isn't ready to go cold turkey, so to speak. And how could you go cold turkey with eating anyway? You got to eat every day.
Yeah.
It naturally speaks to this idea of moderation and just starting to decrease your use, even if you're not ready to quit smoking or drinking or eating delicious bacon cheeseburgers all at once. So the technique that we prescribe early on, even to people who are not ready to completely commit to changing their addictive behavior, is this technique that we call the stop practice. And the stop practice is a very simple technique. And the first step is to is S, to stop right before you take drugs or engage in the addictive behavior. And instead of just immediately jumping in and doing the behavior out of automatic habit, actually stop and bring some mindfulness to this activity. The next step is T. So take a few minutes to practice mindful breathing as a way to calm down the mind and calm down the body. So here you are in the presence of the drug. Let me give you an example so we can make this concrete. Let's say you take opioids and you take them 4 times a day, and you've been waiting 3 hours and 57 minutes since your last dose, and you take your pill bottle and you take the lid off and you pull your pill out and you're about to eat your pill, and I tell you to stop and don't eat the pill, but instead to take a few minutes to practice mindful breathing. The next step in the process is O, and that's to observe your thoughts and feelings and body sensations in that moment. So what do you think you're going to observe when you're holding this pill a few inches from your face? You're probably going to observe feeling agitated. You're probably going to observe feelings of craving, feelings of anxiety. Hey, I really want to take this pill. Why the heck can't I take it? But you might also begin to observe that it's possible to have an urge, but you don't have to give in to the urge. That the urge to take the pill and the action of taking the pill are two separate things. You can actually separate them in your mind. You might also start to notice that urges don't last forever, and that the longer you stay with this pill without taking it, the weaker the urge is becoming. And of course, you can always return your attention back to your breath as a way to calm down the mind and calm down the body while you're doing this observing process. And then the last step of the stop process is P, and that is to proceed with intention. So, of course, it's always the person's choice whether or not they take the drug, but they should do it. If they do choose to take the drug, they should do it with full attention and respect and awareness. Recognize I'm putting this powerful chemical in my brain and my body, and that has consequences. And think about the consequences. Play the tape out. Think about the consequences and be aware of what you're doing. But what many people discover is that after practicing a few minutes of mindfulness like this, that maybe they don't feel as distressed anymore. Maybe they don't need the relief from taking that drug or doing that addictive behavior. That they may start to feel like they're giving themselves some relief through mindfulness. And that becomes the jumping off point for many people to change their addictive behavior. So that's a really simple practice. We teach it in the very first session of More. We encourage people to do it. And the key part is we're not telling people to not take the drug.
Right.
It's their choice. It's just, we just want you to stop for a few minutes before you do it and bring full mindfulness and awareness and intentionality to this otherwise automatic habit, and then decide if you want to do it. And at that point, many people decide, you know what, I don't.
Yeah, we hear that a lot, that between that reaction and then the action you take, that's sort of where the freedom is, right? Is
Right.
that pause. And so that's amazing. This conversation is so inspiring. I learned so much, Dr. Garland. So what is next for you and the More method?
What's next for me is to get this out to the world. We've spent 20 years developing and testing this therapy and $90 million of federal research grants. And now what's next is now that we know that it works, and More really does work. It works for addiction. It works for pain. It works for emotional distress. The next step is to really bring it to the communities that need it. And so I'm working really hard to train as many clinicians and counselors and peer support folks all around the country and all around the world in More as I can. So we've trained over 1,000 people so far and more who are now delivering More in their communities. And we have an online training program to train folks in More. That's at the website moretherapy.com. And it's an online on-demand training program that people can do from the comfort of their own home, and learning these techniques and learning how to use them with clients. So again, I'll say it again, moretherapy.com.
Yeah.
And that is really my life's work at this point, to get this out to the communities that need it. And So I really appreciate this opportunity speaking with you to be able to do it. We've developed a More app that can help support people in learning the More techniques. So it has all of the More mind-body practices and meditations and the educational material. And you can also find that on the moretherapy.com website. So between the training program and the app, we've really tried to build something that people can just take and start using immediately to help themselves and helping their clients.
It sounds amazing. I hope everyone goes out and takes this training. Thank you so much, Dr. Garland.
Thank you so much. This has really been a great conversation.
Yeah. And thank you all for listening to Sisters in Sobriety, and we will see you next week. This was Sisters in Sobriety.
Thank you for listening and being with us today.
If you want to learn more about sobriety and meet your community, find us at sistersinsobriety.substack.com.
Are you a sister in sobriety? Then reach out on social media. We'd love to hear from you.
If you're feeling generous, leave us 5 stars and a review and follow us wherever you listen.
You'll never miss an episode. Until next time.